Bismarck, see March 3, 1943. Dawn breaks over the endless Pacific as the convoy of 8 Japanese transports and 8 destroyers cuts across the calm waters toward New Guinea. On the bridge of his flagship, Shirayuki Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura watches the horizon through his binoculars. The sea belongs to Japan, or so he believes. Beneath him, the decks are crowded with soldiers of the 51st Division, their uniforms pressed their rifles, oiled their confidence unshaken. They have sailed these routes for over a year without serious challenge. The Imperial Navy has made this voyage routine. The ships are loaded with ammunition, food, and 6,900 troops meant to reinforce the garrisons at Leh. Their engines rumble with assurance. They are protected by what Japanese doctrine calls an umbrella of steel destroyers, armed with 5-inch dual-purpose guns, layers of 25mm cannons, and dozens of machine guns ready to spit fire at any enemy foolish enough to approach. For the officers on deck, the air smells of diesel and salt familiar and comforting. The war feels distant here. Above them, the sky is bright and silent, no hint of danger. The Japanese have seen American bombers before high-altitude fortresses that drop their bombs far off target torpedo planes that die before reaching range. They have learned to laugh at the clumsy attacks of the Americans. Their confidence rests on experience, and experience they believe cannot lie. But far to the south, beyond the morning haze, a different kind of machine begins to climb into the light. In a rough workshop near Brisbane, men in oil-stained overalls had spent months turning a standard bomber into something new, something monstrous. They replaced the bombardier's seat with 8 heavy Browning .50 caliber machine guns and welded steel plates into the nose to keep the structure from tearing apart. Each gun could fire 850 rounds a minute, unleashing a storm of 6,800 bullets every 60 seconds. They called it the B-25 Strafer. Now those machines are approaching low over the waves' engines, howling like thunder against the wind. From the Japanese decks, lookouts spot distant flashes glinting in the morning sun. They mistake them for high-altitude bombers, the kind they know how to fight. Orders echo across the convoy, all guns ready. Maintain formation. The destroyers turn slightly, preparing to create the familiar curtain of anti-aircraft fire. The first bursts of tracer rounds arc into the sky, red and green streaks marking the air above the ships. But the American formation doesn't climb. It keeps coming lower and faster, skimming the surface of the sea until the propellers slice through spray. At 09:05 hours, the illusion of safety shatters. The sound hits first a roar deeper than thunder, as if the ocean itself is tearing open. Then the flashes, dozens of them. The noses of the B-25s erupt in white light, and the air fills with the metallic scream of machine guns firing in perfect synchronization. The first destroyer, Shirayuki, takes the full impact. Her bridge explodes in a cloud of glass and flame. Armor plates melt, crewmen vanish in sprays of red mist. Within seconds, the guns that once promised protection fall silent, their operators shredded before they can return fire. The sky and the sea merge in chaos. In the confusion, one officer tries to shout orders, but the noise of the guns drowns his voice. They're not bombing, someone yells. They're shooting. The realization spreads through the ships like fire through oil. These are not ordinary bombers. They are something else, something designed to kill ships at point-blank range. The sea boils with ricochets and burning fuel. The smell of cordite and salt fills the air. From the air, the American pilots see everything with terrifying clarity. The muzzle flashes reflect off the silver fuselages. Below them, ships twist and burn, sending black smoke towers into the blue sky. The radio chatter is calm, almost mechanical. Target hit. Moving to next. The attack lasts less than 15 minutes, but when it ends, the Bismarck Sea is unrecognizable. It is no longer water, it is flame. The Japanese convoy that once symbolized naval power now drifts in ruin. Soldiers leap into burning waves, their rifles useless, their eyes filled with disbelief. For those who survive, there will be no explanation, only the memory of metal and fire. For the Americans, it is proof that innovation can rewrite the rules of war. A weapon built in a jungle workshop has just destroyed an entire convoy protected by destroyers and doctrine. And in that moment, something changes forever. Technology, not tradition, has taken command of the Pacific. If you believe Japan never imagined what was waiting for them beneath that horizon, comment 1 below. But if you think they could have survived this storm, hit like and tell us why. 2 days before the sea turned to fire, the Japanese convoy left the harbor at Rabaul under a brilliant blue sky. The ocean was calm, the wind steady, and every ship's engine beat in harmony, like a steel heart driving the empire forward. To the men aboard, this felt like routine. Convoys like this had crossed the Bismarck Sea countless times before. Each voyage carried supplies, ammunition, and men replacements for those who had fallen in the jungles of New Guinea. They were the arteries of Japan's southern empire, and Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura believed this one would reach its destination safely, as all the others had. He had reason to be confident. The Imperial Navy still ruled the Western Pacific. The American fleet had not dared to challenge their destroyers directly since the early months of the war. The convoy itself was a demonstration of Japanese precision. 8 transports in column formation, each carrying hundreds of soldiers surrounded by a screen of destroyers, the Asagumo Shirakumo Tokitsukaze, and others armed with twin 5-inch guns and multiple 25mm anti-aircraft cannons. Every position was manned, every weapon loaded, every man drilled to respond within seconds of an alarm. Below deck, soldiers of the 51st Division filled the holds packed shoulder to shoulder between crates of ammunition and sacks of rice. Many were young men from Hiroshima and Osaka, recently trained, eager to prove themselves. They joked, shared cigarettes, wrote letters home. "We will be in Leh in 3 days," one soldier said. "After that, maybe Port Moresby." The thought of American planes no longer frightened them. They had seen their bombs fall harmlessly into the sea. The high-altitude B-17s always missed. The Japanese Navy had built an entire doctrine around that fact. Ships that stayed in tight formation firing together could create an impenetrable shield of fire. They called it the umbrella of steel. On the bridge of the destroyer, Shirakumo Commander Tamichihara looked through his binoculars at the horizon. He was calm, disciplined, certain. "The Americans rely on luck," he told his gunnery officer. "We rely on training." In the logbook, the watch officer recorded sea conditions calm, visibility excellent, enemy aircraft none. Somewhere in the distance, tropical birds drifted above the endless waves. To the north, radio operators monitored the airwaves for Allied signals. Nothing. They didn't know that hundreds of miles away, Allied codebreakers at Port Moresby had already intercepted their departure order. American and Australian pilots were planning timing, calculating. For the Japanese, this voyage was not just a supply run, it was a statement of dominance. Every destroyer flew the rising sun flag, high, proud symbols of an empire that believed itself untouchable. The officers in their crisp uniforms drank tea on the bridge, speaking quietly of home. They trusted their doctrine, their equipment, their discipline. For over a year, these waters had been theirs. Night fell on the second day, bringing the kind of stillness that only the open sea can hold. The ships glowed faintly under moonlight, their wakes stretching behind like silver ribbons. Sailors smoked in silence, listening to the steady thrum of engines. From the lead destroyer came the sound of a bugle marking midnight watch. In the distance, flashes of lightning danced on the horizon, but it was only weather, nothing more. At dawn, Admiral Kimura stood again on the bridge of his flagship. He looked over the convoy, 16 ships gliding perfectly in formation, the ocean gleaming like glass. His staff reported that the 11th Air Fleet at Rabaul would provide fighter cover if needed. The plan was flawless. The Americans were weak, scattered, disorganized. In his mind, the outcome was already decided. In the convoy's radio room, a young operator recorded a message from headquarters: enemy aircraft activity low. Proceed as planned. He smiled, folded the paper, and slipped it into a logbook. The sound of engines continued, rhythmic and steady, echoing through steel bulkheads. Far above the ocean, out of sight, American reconnaissance planes were already watching. Photographs taken that morning showed the entire convoy, every ship, every wake, clearly visible from 10,000 feet. Intelligence officers at Port Moresby marked them on maps and calculated intercept points. Their confidence matched Kimura's, but for different reasons. They knew something the Japanese didn't. The Americans had built a new kind of weapon. For now, though, Kimura's men felt untouchable. They had survived every previous attack. When rumors spread about Allied planes with extra guns mounted in their noses, the officers laughed. Propaganda, they said. No aircraft can destroy a convoy this size. By evening, the mood aboard the ships was almost festive. The cooks served hot rice and miso soup. On one transport, soldiers sang folk songs. Others stood on deck watching the sunset over the Pacific, thinking of home. None of them realized they were being followed, that the clear sky that comforted them also made them visible. When darkness came again, the horizon glowed faintly with lightning, but in that flicker of light, no one saw the silhouettes moving far to the south. B-25 bombers refueling crews, checking their weapons, pilots receiving final orders. The men on the Japanese ships believed the ocean protected them. They didn't know that within hours, that same ocean would rise up against them, set ablaze by the storm of fire descending from the sky. If you believe the Japanese convoy had every reason to feel safe, comment 2 below. If you think their confidence was already a fatal mistake, hit like and tell us what you would have done in their place. Thousands of miles from the burning equator in a dusty corner of Brisbane, a group of men were breaking every rule of aircraft design. Their workshop was little more than a hangar patched with corrugated metal, filled with the smell of oil cordite and sweat. Tools clattered against concrete. Sparks from welding torches painted the walls orange. It was here, not in a factory, not in Washington, but in this forgotten corner of Australia, that a man named Paul "Pappy" Gunn decided to change the course of the Pacific War. Pappy Gunn wasn't an ordinary officer. He was 50 years old, gray at the temples, with the rough hands of a mechanic and the temper of a man who hated bureaucracy more than he hated the enemy. A former Navy pilot turned civilian engineer, he had lived in the Philippines before the war, where he built and repaired aircraft for local airlines. When Japan invaded, his wife and children were captured. Gunn joined the U.S. Army Air Forces out of rage, not ambition. Every modification he made carried that personal fury, the kind that turns grief into innovation. The problem was simple but deadly. American bombers could not hit ships. High-altitude bombers missed moving targets. Torpedo planes required long, straight approaches that made them easy prey for anti-aircraft fire. Every convoy attack ended the same way, bombs splashing harmlessly into the sea while Japanese gunners laughed. The 5th Air Force needed something that could fly low, hit fast, and survive. Gunn believed the answer wasn't a new plane, it was rethinking the one they already had, the B-25. Mitchell was a medium bomber, reliable, rugged, but never meant to attack ships. Its nose was built for a bombardier, not for guns. Gunn looked at one and saw empty space. "That's wasted metal," he said. "Why drop a bomb when you can shoot your target to pieces?" He and a handful of mechanics started stripping the nose clean, removing the bombardier's seat, the glass panels, the wiring for the Norden bomb sight. In their place, they welded steel supports and began mounting Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 2 at first, then 4, then 6. Eventually they fit 8. Each gun fired 850 rounds per minute. Together, the 8 could unleash 6 of them 800 rounds a minute, more firepower than an entire destroyer's deck battery concentrated into a single point. The mechanics had to reinforce the nose structure to keep the aircraft from shaking apart under recoil. Ammunition boxes lined the fuselage like veins feeding a mechanical beast. Every inch had to be recalculated for balance. The weight of the ammunition alone reached 500 pounds. Gunn did the math on a notepad, wiping sweat from his face. "It'll fly," he muttered. Barely. The first test flight nearly destroyed the plane. When the pilot fired all 8 guns, the recoil slammed the B-25 backward in the air. The entire nose shook like it had been hit by a hammer. Rivets popped loose. The pilot landed white-knuckled and grinning. "It works," he said. Gunn just smiled. "Good," he replied. "Now, make it mean." They added armor plating to the cockpit, rewired the triggers so the pilot could fire everything from the yoke, and rerouted ammunition feeds to prevent jamming. They even replaced bomb racks with smaller skip bomb mounts, so the aircraft could drop low-release a 500-pound bomb and make it bounce across the water into the side of a ship. The Australians watched this transformation with disbelief. One officer called it madness. Gunn didn't care. "If you think it's crazy," he said, "then you haven't seen what doesn't work." Soon the modified aircraft earned a new nickname among the crew's gunships, or simply strafers. They were monsters of aluminum and gunpowder, built not in a laboratory, but by men who refused to accept defeat. Word spread quickly across the Pacific. Pilots lined up to fly the modified B-25s, though none of them truly understood what they were getting into. Major Edward Larner of the 90th Bombardment Squadron recalled his first look at the new nose. 8 guns in the front, 4 more on the sides, 2 in the turret, he said later. "I remember thinking, this isn't a bomber anymore. It's a flying buzzsaw." The test range was an old wreck off the coast of Port Moresby. The crews flew in, low-lined up, and opened fire. What followed was pure chaos. The guns lit up the sky, the sound so violent it rattled windows miles away. The wrecked ship seemed to disintegrate under the impact, torn apart by hundreds of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. When the pilots landed, their faces were black with powder. "You could smell the heat," one said. "You could feel the air vibrate." By late February 1943, the new weapon was ready. General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, watched a demonstration and immediately understood what he was seeing. "You've just built the first commerce destroyer," he told Gunn. The idea spread like wildfire. More B-25s were converted. The 90th Squadron became the first full strafer unit flying out of New Guinea. Each aircraft bore a name scrawled in white paint across its nose. Ruthless Hell's Fire Black Magic. Mechanics painted shark mouths and teeth under the guns as if to warn the enemy of what was coming. Meanwhile, Japanese naval intelligence had no idea this transformation was happening. To them, the B-25 was still just a medium bomber, slow, clumsy, predictable. Their anti-aircraft drills were designed for high-altitude attacks, not for a wave of low-flying machines coming in at treetop level with 8 guns blazing. The Americans were about to change every rule the Japanese had written about air defense. In the final days of February, as news of a large Japanese convoy moving toward Leh reached Allied headquarters, guns modified B-25s were loaded and waiting. Crews checked their guns, their bombs, their armor. A mechanic wiped his hands on a rag and looked at the planes lined up on the field. "They said this couldn't be done," he muttered. "Let's see them say that after tomorrow." When dawn came, the roar of radial engines filled the Australian sky. The pilots took off in pairs, banking toward the north. The plan was simple but deadly. The high-altitude B-17s would attack first, drawing the Japanese anti-aircraft fire upward. Then the B-25 strafers and the Australian Beaufighters would come in at wave height, below radar, below expectation, and tear the convoy apart. None of them could have imagined how completely it would work. In a few hours, the Pacific would witness a kind of warfare no one had seen before, a blend of industrial ingenuity, raw courage, and brutal precision. A handful of mechanics in Brisbane had turned an ordinary bomber into a ship-killing machine. If you believe that true innovation is born from desperation, comment 3 below. But if you think this was reckless, dangerous, and almost insane, hit like and share your thoughts. March 3, 1943. The morning sun burned through the low clouds above the Bismarck Sea, turning the water into a sheet of silver. Far below the Japanese convoy pressed onward 16 ships cutting neat white wakes across the calm surface. The soldiers aboard had eaten breakfast, cleaned their rifles, and stood at the rails staring at the horizon. The sky looked peaceful. There was no hint that this day would become one of the most violent 15 minutes in naval history. At 8:45 a.m., the first American aircraft appeared tiny specks at 7,000 feet. Lookouts aboard the destroyer Asashio shouted the alarm. Sirens wailed. Anti-aircraft guns swung upward. Enemy bombers medium altitude, the officers barked. Every Japanese gunner had drilled for this moment. The ships tightened formation, the destroyers maneuvering to screen the slower transports. Tracers rose in bright red arcs, the sound of gunfire echoing across the sea. To the Japanese, this was a familiar fight. They had beaten off high-level bombers before. But that was exactly what the Americans wanted them to believe. The B-17 flying fortresses up high were bait. While the Japanese guns thundered skyward, the real attack approached unseen, skimming just above the waves. From the southwest came a line of shapes so low they threw up rooster tails of water behind them. 12 B-25 strafers of the U.S. 5th Air Force, followed closely by 13 Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters. Major Edward Ed Larner led the formation in his plane Ruthless. Ahead of him, the sea stretched flat and gleaming. He could already see the masts of the Japanese ships. "This is it," he said over the radio. "Guns hot." The pilots dropped lower 50 feet above the water engines, screaming at full throttle. Spray from the propeller wash streaked the windshields. The crews felt every vibration through their seats. When the range closed to 1,200 yards, Larner squeezed the trigger. The effect was instantaneous. 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns opened up at once, belching fire and brass. The roar was deafening, a mechanical scream that shook the entire airframe. The tracers formed perfect lines of light that reached across the sea and smashed into the destroyer Shirayuki. The ship's bridge erupted in a storm of sparks and smoke. Windows shattered, armor plates peeled away, men vanished in bursts of flame. Larner kept firing, walking his tracers along the deck. Gun crews were cut down where they stood. Ammunition boxes exploded, sending orange fireballs into the air. The Shirayuki's 5-inch guns fell silent as the crew was torn apart by bullets moving at 2,900 feet per second. In 8 seconds, more than 900 rounds tore through the ship's superstructure. Then Larner released 2 500-pound bombs at skip bombing altitude. They bounced twice on the surface like stones, slammed into the hull below the waterline, and detonated with delayed fuses. The explosion broke the ship's back. The destroyer rolled to port, smoke pouring from her funnel. Behind Larner, the sky filled with streaking B-25s, each finding its target. Lieutenant John Hennebrey, in Hell's Fury, lined up on the transport Kyokusei Maru and unleashed a solid beam of fire from bow to stern. The bullets ripped through the bridge, severed the ship's wheel, and killed the helmsman instantly. As Hennebrey's bomb struck, the vessel shuddered and began to list. Hundreds of soldiers below deck, packed into the cargo holds, had no chance to escape. Flight Sergeant Fred Cassidy of the Australian No. 30 Squadron dove his Beaufighter to mast height and opened fire with his 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns. The rounds exploded across the decks of the transport Tateyama Maru, throwing sailors into the air like rag dolls. You could see the bridge disintegrate, Cassidy recalled later. It wasn't a ship anymore. It was just pieces. The convoy dissolved into chaos. Ships veered wildly to avoid collisions. Smoke covered the horizon. Fires spread across decks slick with burning oil. The Japanese gunners tried to fight back, but their tracers flashed uselessly over the waves. The attackers were too low, too fast, too many. A destroyer tried to shield a transport by turning broadside, but 3 B-25s pounced on her together. 24 machine guns fired in unison, shredding her from bow to stern. The combined impact turned the vessel into a storm of steel and flame. Out of control, she collided with the transport she was protecting. Both ships burst into fireballs. From above, the B-17s watched the slaughter unfold through drifting smoke. What they saw defied logic: bombers attacking like fighter planes, carving ships apart with guns. It was industrial destruction, methodical and unstoppable. Within 10 minutes, the sea was littered with wreckage. Burning lifeboats drifted among floating bodies. Ammunition aboard the transports cooked off, filling the air with secondary explosions. Aboard the surviving Japanese ships, men fought desperately to contain the inferno. Buckets of seawater were thrown onto fires that only grew hotter. Some tried to man anti-aircraft guns, but the next wave of B-25s swept in at treetop height, cutting them down before they could aim. The air was filled with fire, one survivor later said. You could not breathe without tasting metal. As the attack continued, Admiral Kimura stood on the bridge of his flagship, trying to understand what he was seeing. He had trained his entire career for naval warfare, but nothing in any manual described this. "These are not bombers," he muttered. "They are something else." He watched helplessly as his fleet disintegrated. By 10:00 a.m., the battle was over. In just 15 minutes of concentrated attack, the Japanese convoy ceased to exist. Every transport was sinking or on fire. 4 destroyers were gone. The others limped away, their decks riddled with holes, their crews decimated. Out of nearly 7,000 men, fewer than 1,200 would survive. The rest disappeared beneath the burning waves. The Americans turned for home, their aircraft scarred by shrapnel but largely intact. The radio chatter was quiet. No cheering, just stunned disbelief. Major Larner looked down at the inferno shrinking behind him and whispered, "We did it." In the distance, columns of black smoke climbed thousands of feet into the air, marking the graves of ships and men. On the beaches of New Guinea coast, watchers radioed a single sentence back to Allied command: "Convoy annihilated." It was not exaggeration, it was fact. The combination of strafing and skip bombing had changed naval warfare forever. When reports reached Port Moresby, Papillon received the news in silence. The workshop that had once smelled of oil and coffee had created a weapon capable of destroying an entire fleet in a quarter of an hour. He walked outside, looked up at the sky, and said only, "Now they'll believe it works." In Tokyo, the news arrived as disbelief. How could a handful of bombers destroy an entire convoy under heavy escort? The Imperial Navy began to realize that the rules had changed. That doctrine, discipline, and courage meant nothing against the cold precision of innovation. That morning, over the Bismarck Sea, the age of the battleship ended. Industrial firepower had taken its place. If you believe this 15-minute attack changed the course of the Pacific War, comment 4 below. But if you think Japan could have found a way to adapt and survive, hit like and tell us how. When the last echoes of gunfire faded over the Bismarck Sea, the Pacific was silent again. What had been an orderly convoy just hours earlier was now a floating graveyard. Smoke pillars rose miles into the sky, visible even to reconnaissance planes flying hundreds of miles away. Burned timbers drifted amid patches of flaming oil. Men clung to wreckage, their uniforms blackened, their faces blank with shock. Some whispered prayers to ancestors who could no longer hear them. Others simply stared upward as if the heavens themselves had turned against them. As the surviving destroyers limped northward toward Rabaul Rear, Admiral Masatomi, Kimura stood on the shattered deck of his flagship, the Shikinami. His face was streaked with soot, his uniform torn, his voice gone hoarse from shouting orders no one could carry out. 4 of his destroyers, Shirayuki, Asagumo, Tokitsukaze, and Arashio, were gone. All 8 transports had vanished beneath the burning sea. Of the 6,900 soldiers he had sworn to deliver to Leh, barely 1,200 had survived, many pulled half dead from the water. He understood even before the rescue ships arrived that the convoy was not just lost, it had been erased. The magnitude of the disaster reached Tokyo within 24 hours. In a dimly lit operations room at the Imperial Naval Headquarters, officers gathered around a table littered with charts and casualty lists. The initial report seemed impossible: 8 transports and 4 destroyers sunk in one morning. Losses in men and equipment beyond calculation. "This cannot be correct," one staff officer said. But the numbers did not change. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, read the report in silence. He had built Japan's naval strategy on confidence, on the belief that discipline and courage could overcome industrial disadvantage. Now he held proof that courage was no longer enough. B-25 bombers modified for strafing, Yamamoto murmured. 8 machine guns in the nose. Skip bombing at mast height. He removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and whispered, "So this is what it means to fight an enemy with factories instead of doctrines." Around the table no one spoke. The weight of the realization hung in the air. The age of traditional surface warfare was ending, replaced by an age of air power and innovation that Japan could not match. In the days that followed, fragments of wreckage and burned bodies washed ashore along New Guinea's coast. Allied intelligence officers combed through the debris, confirming the scale of the destruction. One Australian coast watcher described the scene. It looked like the ocean itself had caught fire. You could smell it miles away. Newspapers in Sydney and San Francisco carried headlines that seemed almost exaggerated. Japan's convoy obliterated 15 minutes of hell over the Bismarck Sea, but every word was true. Within the Imperial Navy, the psychological shock was immediate and devastating. For a decade, Japanese officers had been trained to think of war as a matter of spirit of willpower and sacrifice. Now they were forced to confront an enemy that fought with mathematics, physics, and mechanical precision. Meetings at naval academies turned grim as instructors debated how to counter a weapon they could barely understand. "How do we defend against this?" one commander asked. "They come too low for radar, too fast for our guns. Our doctrine is useless." Desperation led to improvisation. Orders went out to add more light anti-aircraft guns to transports and to disperse convoys at wider intervals. New training drills emphasized low-level attacks, but none of it mattered. The B-25 Strafer had rewritten the rules. Every convoy that followed the Bismarck disaster was smaller, slower, and more cautious. Yet caution could not protect them. Allied aircraft now hunted Japanese shipping like predators that had learned the scent of blood. By April 1943, Yamamoto's staff began calculating the logistical collapse that would follow. Without convoys, the garrisons at Les Salamaua and New Britain would starve. Japan's supply routes through the South Pacific were effectively dead. "We can no longer move," by day one report admitted. "Every daylight voyage will be suicide." Within weeks, Japan shifted to nighttime resupply missions using destroyers and submarines to carry small loads under the cover of darkness. But the capacity of these night runs was a fraction of what the convoys had delivered. Ammunition ran out. Troops went hungry. Diseases spread. On the front lines, soldiers who had once cheered the rising sun began to feel abandoned. One officer in New Guinea wrote in his diary, "We hear engines every morning, but they are not ours. The sky belongs to the Americans now." Another wrote simply, "We are forgotten men." The psychological blow rippled outward from the Bismarck Sea to every outpost of Japan's empire. The sense of invincibility that had carried the imperial forces through the first years of war evaporated in a single morning. Meanwhile, in Australia, the mood was very different. At Port Moresby, air crews who had participated in the attack returned to base, exhausted but triumphant. Mechanics ran to meet them cheering, slapping the wings of the bullet-riddled B-25s. General George Kenney congratulated Pappy Gunn personally. "You just changed the way we fight," he said. Gunn only shrugged. "We didn't invent anything new," he replied. "We just stopped doing what didn't work." But in his voice there was pride, the quiet pride of a man who had built something that mattered. The Allied press celebrated the victory, but among the pilots there was little joy. They had seen what 8 machine guns could do to a human body, how ships full of men could vanish in seconds. One pilot later wrote, "I knew we had to do it, but God help me, I can still hear them screaming." The Bismarck Sea had proven the effectiveness of innovation, but it also revealed the moral cost of industrial warfare. Killing had become faster, colder, more efficient. The mechanics who had built the guns could never have imagined what their creation would look like in action. In Tokyo, Yamamoto ordered an emergency review of convoy procedures. He suggested that air cover be increased and that supply lines be shifted to submarine transport. But privately, he admitted to his aides that there might be no solution. "They will adapt faster than we can," he said. "Every time we find a defense, they will build something new." 6 weeks later, Yamamoto's plane was ambushed and shot down over Bougainville by American P-38s, an operation planned using intercepted Japanese communications. His death symbolized the end of Japan's strategic initiative in the Pacific. By summer, the lessons of the Bismarck Sea had become doctrine for the Allies. Low-level strafing and skip bombing were taught to every bomber crew in the Southwest Pacific. Entire squadrons of B-25s were converted into gunships. The Americans had not just won a battle, they had found a formula. From that point on, Japanese convoys would move under cover of night-hugging coastlines praying for clouds. Daylight on the Pacific had become American territory. For Japan, the loss went beyond ships and men. It marked the death of an idea, the belief that discipline could overcome technology, that tradition could defeat industry. The empire that had built its power on the samurai spirit now faced a new kind of enemy, one that built weapons in assembly lines and tested them in laboratories, one that turned imagination into destruction faster than anyone could predict. In the years that followed, Japanese historians would look back on the Bismarck Sea as the moment when the Imperial Navy's fate was sealed. Professor Masanori of the Japanese Defense University later wrote, "It was not the sinking of ships that doomed us. It was the sinking of our confidence. After that day, we no longer believed we could win." That morning, amid the smoke and fire, Admiral Kimura watched the sea swallow his fleet and understood what Yamamoto would later put into words: the war had shifted from courage to calculation, from the sword to the machine. And once that transformation began, there was no turning back. If you believe Japan's defeat was sealed not by soldiers, but by innovation, comment 5 below. But if you think spirit could still have triumphed over technology, hit like and tell us why. History often records battles as victories or defeats, but some moments go beyond either. They become turning points in the story of how humanity fights. The Bismarck Sea was one of those moments. From the wreckage of Japanese ships and the smoke of innovation, a new era of warfare was born, one where the battlefield was no longer decided by fleets or formations, but by the imagination of engineers, the courage of pilots, and the cold logic of industrial firepower. When the news of the victory reached Brisbane, the hangar at Eagle Farm felt strangely quiet. The same workshop that had echoed with the clang of wrenches and the hiss of welding torches now stood still. Pappy Gunn sat on a crate of ammunition boxes staring at a photo of his family, the family he had lost in the Philippines. His mechanics gathered around celebrating with laughter, cigarettes, and stories of the mission. Yet Gunn didn't smile. He had built something that worked too well. What started as an experiment in survival had turned into a weapon that could erase an entire convoy in 15 minutes. General George Kenney visited the workshop that week. "You did it, Pappy," he said. "You turned bombers into battleships." Gunn shook his head. "No, sir," he replied quietly. "We turned mechanics into designers." That sentence captured what the war in the Pacific had become: a contest, not only of armies, but of minds. America's strength wasn't just its factories, it was its ability to turn frustration into invention chaos, into method, and fear into innovation. As the months passed, more B-25s were modified. North American Aviation incorporated Gunn's field design into factory models. The late-war B-25J series carried up to 18 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns, transforming the aircraft into flying arsenals. The 345th Bombardment Group, known as the Air Apaches, took these planes to every corner of the Pacific, hunting Japanese shipping airfields and supply depots. Pilots painted snarling shark mouths on the noses, turning the aircraft into mechanical predators that struck terror into anyone who saw them. The Japanese tried to adapt. They mounted extra anti-aircraft guns on every available surface, built radar-guided defenses, and even trained suicide pilots to ram attacking planes. None of it stopped the destruction. The lesson of the Bismarck Sea spread across the Pacific: industrial creativity could outthink bravery, and precision could annihilate tradition. By 1944, Japanese naval reports no longer spoke of enemy bombers. They simply called them death machines. But the influence of the B-25 Strafer didn't end with the war. When peace returned, military engineers around the world studied the concept of a heavily armed, forward-firing aircraft that could support ground and sea operations. Out of that study came a direct descendant, the AC-47 Spooky, a modified transport aircraft used in Vietnam. Like the B-25, it carried an arsenal of side-firing guns capable of turning battlefields into burning ground. Its nickname Puff the Magic Dragon carried a strange echo of the old gunship's roar over the Bismarck Sea. Decades later, the idea evolved again with the AC-130 Spectre. It carried cannon sensors and computers capable of erasing a convoy, a base, or a battlefield with terrifying precision. Its crews often quoted a simple phrase when describing their aircraft. It all started with a mechanic in a jungle workshop. They were right. The lineage of the modern gunship leads directly back to Pappy Gunn's improvisation in Brisbane, a moment when war met imagination, and imagination won. The legacy of the B-25 Strafer is more than mechanical, it's philosophical. It proved that victory favors those who refuse to accept limits. In 1943, when conventional wisdom said bombers couldn't hit ships, one man refused to listen. He picked up a wrench and built his own solution. That defiance became the blueprint for an entire generation of engineers and soldiers who learned that the battlefield rewards creativity more than conformity. Yet the story carries a darker truth. Innovation doesn't just create power, it transforms it. The same ingenuity that gave the Allies victory also opened the door to an age of mechanized annihilation where wars could be fought with such efficiency that humanity itself seemed smaller in comparison. The B-25 Strafer didn't just destroy ships. It destroyed the illusion that war was still a matter of personal courage. It became a matter of systems, of design, of numbers. In post-war Japan, naval historians called the Bismarck Sea the day the machine defeated the man. They meant it literally. Admiral Kimura survived the battle and lived to see Japan surrender. In interviews years later, he spoke with quiet reflection. We fought with discipline and heart. They fought with invention. We did not lose to their soldiers. We lost to their factories. His words echoed Yamamoto's warning before Pearl Harbor that Japan could not hope to win a long war against a nation of engineers. In the United States, the surviving crews of B-25 Strafer units held reunions long after the war ended. Old men with silver hair and steady eyes gathered in hangars, standing beside restored aircraft, gleaming under museum lights. They told stories of those 15 minutes over the Bismarck Sea of the fire, the smoke, the roar of the guns. One pilot said, "We didn't know we were making history. We were just trying to survive." Another replied softly, "That's how history is made." For historians, the Bismarck Sea stands as a case study in transformation. For veterans, it remains a memory of both triumph and terror. For engineers, it is proof that creativity can win wars. And for the world, it is a warning. Every great leap forward in technology brings humanity one step closer to its own limits. As the final lights fade over the Pacific, the image endures silver aircraft flying low over a sea of fire, their machine guns blazing in synchronized fury. It is both beautiful and horrifying, a symbol of what happens when necessity becomes invention, and invention becomes destruction. The story of the B-25 Strafer ends not with victory, but with a question. When technology can destroy an empire, in 15 minutes, what part of humanity is left behind? If you believe progress always comes with a price, comment 6 below. But if you think innovation is worth every risk, hit like and tell us why. And if you want to see how this story connects to the next chapter, the rise of jet warfare and the fall of the battleship age, subscribe now. The next story begins where the sea stopped burning. April 7th, 1945. The waters of the East China Sea were calm, almost unnaturally so. The horizon shimmered in pale gray light as a shape too immense to comprehend sliced through the morning mist. Her name was Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, 263 meters of armored steel, carrying the weight of a nation's pride on her deck. For 5 years she had been whispered about as an unsinkable fortress, a ship so vast that even American intelligence had once doubted its existence. Now, as dawn broke over her steel hull, she was sailing toward her final mission, one that offered no return. Below deck, thousands of men prepared for a voyage they did not expect to survive. Some wrote farewell letters they would never send. Others polished the barrels of the 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval weapons ever mounted on a warship, each shell weighing more than a car, each capable of hitting targets over 20 miles away. To the young sailors, the gun barrels gleamed like the fingers of a god. To the veterans, they were relics of an era already ending. Far above, hundreds of miles away, a different kind of fleet stirred. On the decks of 11 American aircraft carriers, 386 aircraft were being armed and fueled under the cold wind of the Pacific. Pilots tightened oxygen masks and traced the coordinates of a single target, the Yamato. Their orders were clear: destroy her before she could reach Okinawa. Each plane carried bombs and torpedoes, totaling more than 11 tons of explosives. What none of them realized was that this would become the largest aerial assault ever launched against a single ship in human history. At 6:30 a.m., radar aboard the carrier Essex caught the first blip. The operator turned to his commander and said quietly, "We've found her." Aboard the Yamato, no one yet knew that hundreds of aircraft were closing in like a thunderstorm. The sea was silent except for the steady churn of her propellers and the occasional bark of orders echoing across the decks. The men smoked their last cigarettes, their eyes drawn to the endless sky. From a distance, the battleship looked like a moving island. Her armor was thicker than any weapon then known could pierce. She carried anti-aircraft guns, bristling like a forest of steel, 162 in total, and yet they would prove almost useless against what was coming. The Japanese command believed that sheer mass could defy modern warfare, that a ship of this size could withstand anything. But on that morning, the sky itself would prove them wrong. At 10:00 a.m., the pilots of Task Force 58 banked their planes toward the glint of sunlight reflecting off Yamato's superstructure. They could see her outline even from 70 miles away, a black leviathan cutting through the blue. One of them, Lieutenant Roy Corbin, would later recall, "She looked like a mountain in the sea. None of us thought anything that big could move that fast." As they descended, the calm of the morning fractured into chaos. The sky filled with engine roar, tracer fire, and sunlight flashing on wings. On Yamato's bridge, Admiral Seiichi Ito stood silently. He did not shout orders. He simply watched the horizon. He had already told his officers, "Our task is to die with honor." The men around him saluted not out of obedience, but out of acceptance. They knew there would be no air cover, no reinforcements, and no chance to retreat. Their mission was to reach Okinawa, ground the ship, and fight until they were gone. Yet, as the first dots appeared overhead, hundreds of them in perfect formation, they began to understand that their battle would not be fought with shells or torpedoes, but with survival itself. As the sky darkened under the swarm of American planes, the ship's chief radio officer whispered, "It feels like the whole sky is falling." He was right. Within minutes, that sky would unleash more firepower than any battleship had ever endured. The Yamato story, born in the era of steel and pride, was about to end in the era of machines and mathematics. If you believe that industrial power can destroy even the strongest symbols of pride, type 1 in the comments. If you believe Yamato's legend will never sink, hit the like button. Because what happens next is not just the story of a ship, it's the moment the sea met the sky, and both were set on fire. Long before she became a burning monument on the East China Sea, Yamato began as a dream forged in secrecy. In 1937, as Japan's empire expanded across Asia, a quiet race began beneath the surface of diplomacy. The Washington and London naval treaties had limited the size and firepower of battleships worldwide, but Japan had already decided to ignore them. The nation's naval architects believed that if they could not build as many ships as the United States, they would build one ship so powerful it could destroy three. In December 1937, deep inside the Kure Naval Arsenal construction began, under tarpaulins and false roofs, to conceal her size from American reconnaissance. Workers referred to her only as Ship Number 1. The blueprints were guarded as state secrets more valuable than gold. Every dimension pushed the limits of physics 263 meters long, 72,000 tons. When fully loaded, an armor belt thicker than any gun could penetrate, and 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval artillery ever mounted, on a moving platform. Each shell weighed over 200 pounds and could travel 26 miles. To build, Yamato engineers had to reinvent nearly every aspect of ship construction. The dry dock at Kure was too small, so it was expanded in secret. Cranes were rebuilt to handle armor plates that weighed as much as locomotives. New steel alloys were created to resist cracking under pressure. The ship's engines, 12 Campon boilers producing 150,000 horsepower, could propel her through the Pacific at 27 knots, an astonishing feat for a vessel larger than most skyscrapers. Her armor was not just thick, it was layered, sloped, and angled to deflect incoming shells like a fortress wall shaped by geometry. But beyond the engineering, Yamato carried a deeper meaning. To the Japanese people, the ship's name came from their ancient word for Japan itself, Yamato the Great Harmony. Her hull embodied a nation's belief that honor, discipline, and craftsmanship could overcome industrial disadvantage. She was the floating manifestation of national pride, the proof that Japan's spirit could outmatch America's machines. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, once said the battleship is the soul of the fleet. Yet even he understood the contradiction: the future belonged to aircraft, not armor. Still, the Imperial Navy continued to pour its dwindling resources into super battleships. To them, size equaled destiny. No one could imagine that this monument to power would become a symbol of obsolescence before her first major battle. By the time Yamato was launched in December 1941, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor had already changed the world. Crowds gathered at Kure's harbor to watch her massive hull slide into the sea. They wept, cheered, and bowed, as if a living god had descended into the water. The ship gleamed in black and gray, her red rising sun flag fluttering proudly against the morning light. Engineers on the dockside believed they had created perfection, a vessel that could never fall. But from the very moment her hull touched salt water, history had already begun to turn against her. American radar code-breaking and aircraft production were accelerating at an unstoppable rate. The age of steel was being replaced by the age of speed and circuitry. While Japan celebrated Yamato's launch as proof of divine favor across the Pacific, American factories were building aircraft faster than Japan could name them. Inside the ship, life was both disciplined and claustrophobic. Her crew of more than 3,000 men lived in narrow corridors beneath 6 decks of steel. Officers slept in small cabins with tatami mats, sailors in hammocks near the ammunition stores. Meals were cooked by steam from the boilers. When Yamato went to sea, the vibrations of her engines rattled dishes off tables. Every movement of the ship felt like the heartbeat of a mechanical giant. In training exercises, her main guns could shake the sea itself. The shockwave of a single salvo shattered windows on nearby escort vessels. Observers described it as standing beside an earthquake. It was not simply power, it was a statement. Japan wanted the world to hear that sound and understand the empire had built something beyond the imagination of man. Yet even as her hull gleamed and her cannons thundered, a quiet unease grew among her officers. They had seen what happened at Midway, where 4 Japanese carriers were lost to a handful of American dive bombers. They had watched the rise of the aircraft carrier, the new queen of the ocean. To them, Yamato represented the glory of the past, not the logic of the future. She was built for a kind of war that no longer existed. Still, the Imperial Navy clung to her as a talisman. When morale faltered, propaganda films showed her cutting through the Pacific framed by the sunrise. School children were told that Yamato could sink the entire American fleet by herself. In truth, she had already been surpassed before her first shot was fired. By late 1944, Yamato had spent most of the war anchored, waiting for an enemy she would never face on her own terms. Japan no longer had the fuel or air cover to protect her. When she finally received her last orders in April 1945 to sail toward Okinawa, with barely enough fuel for a one-way trip, every man aboard understood what it meant. She was no longer a battleship. She was a symbol marching to her death. The ship that began as Japan's greatest creation was now destined to prove its greatest delusion, that steel could triumph over the sky. If you believe that pride more than weakness destroys empires, type 2 in the comments. If you think Yamato was doomed not by arrogance but by history itself, hit the like button. Because what comes next is not construction, it's destruction. And it begins the moment the sky finds her. By April 1945, Japan was no longer fighting to win, it was fighting to delay the inevitable. American bombers roamed freely over the home islands. Fuel reserves were nearly gone, and the Imperial Navy, once the most feared force in the Pacific, was reduced to a handful of battered ships anchored in hidden bays. Every admiral knew the truth: Japan could not protect itself, let alone launch an offensive. Yet, on the morning of April 5th, a new order arrived from Tokyo. The Yamato, the largest battleship in history, would sail once more. The mission was simple on paper and suicidal in reality. She was to steam south to Okinawa Beach herself, on the shore, and fight as a stationary gun platform until destroyed. There would be no refueling, no resupply, no air cover. When the operation was over, there would be no Yamato. The plan was given the code name Ten-Go Heavenly Operation, as if the gods themselves had written it. For many aboard, it felt less like strategy and more like a funeral procession. In the high offices of the Naval General Staff, voices were raised in bitter argument. Admiral Seiichi Ito, commanding the Second Fleet, protested that sending Yamato without air support was madness. It will be nothing but a sacrifice, he warned. But the logic of defeat had already consumed Tokyo. The Army demanded a show of courage to inspire the nation. They needed a symbol, not a victory. Yamato would become that symbol, the final bloom of the cherry blossom before it fell to the ground. That night, Admiral Ito gathered his senior officers aboard the ship. The men stood in silence as he read the order aloud. When he finished, no one spoke for a long moment. Then Captain Kosaku Aruga, Yamato's commanding officer, saluted and said quietly, "If we must die, let us die striking." Ito nodded. "Then we will sail." At dawn on April 6th, sailors loaded shells into the massive gun turrets, checked watertight compartments, and painted the decks black to reduce glare from the sky. The ship's stores were filled not with rations, but with explosives to maximize the damage when she finally blew apart. Mechanics secured loose machinery, knowing it would never need maintenance again. In the mess hall, young sailors wrote letters home they knew would never be mailed. Some tucked them into waterproof bottles, hoping the sea might one day deliver them. The ship's chaplain, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, walked the lower decks reciting prayers. "Do not think of death," he told the crew, "think of duty." But even duty had begun to feel hollow. Most of the men were teenagers drafted from coastal villages, their faces still soft with youth. They had never fired the ship's main guns in combat. Now, they were being asked to die aboard them. When the final preparations were complete, Admiral Ito gave his last speech on the bridge. "Each man must remember that this is not defeat," he said. "We sail to show the world the spirit of Japan." There was no applause, no cheering, only a quiet chorus of voices replying "Hi." At 4:00 p.m. on April 6th, Yamato slipped her moorings at Tokuyama and began moving slowly down the narrow channel toward the open sea. Her engines rumbled like distant thunder. As she passed the harbor, dock workers stopped and bowed. Many wept. They knew they were watching the last great ship of the Imperial Navy sail for the final time. The battleship was accompanied by one light cruiser, Yahagi, and 8 destroyers, barely enough to protect her for a day. Onboard fuel officers checked their gauges. The tanks were filled to only half capacity. There would be just enough to reach Okinawa, provided they never turned back. Every man aboard understood that once they crossed the strait, there was no return. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the fleet turned south into the East China Sea. The sky burned orange, and the Yamato silhouette stretched across the water like the shadow of a mountain. In the radio room, operators picked up faint English chatter. American submarines were already tracking them. It was too late to hide. At 9:00 p.m., Captain Aruga gathered the bridge officers. "Our course is set," he said. "We proceed to Okinawa at full speed." His voice was steady, but the crew could feel the tension. They were running blind into an ocean owned by the enemy. Through the night, the ship's radar screens flickered with static. At midnight, a young sailor on lookout duty whispered to his companion, "It's so quiet." The other replied, "It's the quiet before the storm." Inside the admiral's quarters, Ito sat alone writing a final message to his family. "I go now to fulfill my duty. Tell our children that I kept my promise." He sealed the letter and handed it to his adjutant. "If by some miracle you live, deliver this." The officer bowed and said nothing. On the horizon, lightning flashed, distant, silent, the edge of a coming storm. By dawn, American reconnaissance planes would spot the fleet. Within hours, the largest ship ever built by human hands would be surrounded by hundreds of aircraft. And yet, on that night, the Yamato moved forward with calm dignity, as if she still believed she could change the tide of history. The crew slept in their stations, clutching rifles they would never use. Some prayed, others simply stared at the ceiling, listening to the heartbeat of the ship. And to them it no longer sounded like an engine. It sounded like time running out. If you believe that courage without strategy leads only to tragedy, type 3 in the comments. If you think Yamato's final voyage was not madness, but duty press-like. Because what happens next is no longer a mission, it is an execution written by the sky itself. At dawn on April 7, 1945, the sea was smooth as glass. The horizon glowed faintly pink, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise over what was about to unfold. Aboard Yamato, the crew was already at battle stations. The smell of machine oil salt and sweat mixed in the cold morning air. Officers barked orders through voice tubes. The rhythmic sound of gun crews loading shells echoed across the decks, and spotters scanned the sky with binoculars searching for the first sign of movement. At 7:30 a.m., the radio room intercepted a coded American transmission. It was brief, almost casual. Large enemy force spotted moving south. Likely Yamato. Those few words sealed her fate. Hundreds of miles away, aboard 11 American carriers of Task Force 58 flight decks exploded into motion. Mechanics rolled 500 and 1,000-pound bombs toward waiting planes. Armorers fitted torpedoes to the bellies of Avengers. The air smelled of fuel and adrenaline. By 8:20, the first wave lifted off. In less than an hour, 386 aircraft fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes filled the sky in disciplined formation. Their destination, one target. Their mission, erase it from the ocean. Commander Joseph W. Finnegan, leading one of the torpedo squadrons, looked down at the endless blue below and muttered, "We're going hunting for a mountain." At 10:14 a.m., Yamato's radar operators reported multiple blips on the northern horizon. Within minutes, hundreds of tiny silver specks appeared against the sunlight. The alarm sounded. Enemy planes approaching. Across the decks, gunners ran to their stations' belts of ammunition, clattering as loaders fed the anti-aircraft gunsons. The ship bristled like a wounded animal ready to fight. The first attack began at 10:26. Dive bombers screamed down from the 10,000 feet, their sirens wailing as they plunged toward the ship's massive hull. The sky shattered into a thunder of explosions. Bombs struck the forward deck, tearing open steel plating and sending fragments ricocheting through the air like shrapnel. Fire erupted across the bow. The concussion knocked men off their feet. Seconds later, torpedo planes swept in low from the port side, their propellers slicing the sea spray. The first torpedo hit near turret number 3, the second near the engine room. The shock threw crewmen against bulkheads. Within 10 minutes, Yamato began to list 5 degrees to port. The ship's pumps fought to keep up, but the flooding spread faster than damage control could respond. On the bridge, Admiral Ito gripped the railing, his face unreadable. "Counterflood starboard tanks," he ordered calmly. "Maintain course." The officers obeyed without hesitation. They still believed they could fight through the storm, but the storm had only begun. At 10:43, the second wave descended. More than 100 planes attacked from every direction. Hellcats strafed the decks, cutting down gunners in flashes of flame. Avengers dropped torpedoes in perfect synchronization, encircling the ship like wolves closing on a wounded prey. The air was filled with black bursts of flak, the deafening roar of the 25 mm guns firing blindly into the chaos. Chief Gunner Seiji Nakamura later recalled, "The noise was beyond sound. It was like the sky itself was tearing apart. He could barely hear his own breathing as bomb after bomb slammed into the armor. One struck near the forward magazines, detonating ammunition and sending a column of smoke thousands of feet high. Another pierced the bridge, killing several officers instantly. Still, Yamato pressed forward. For a moment, it seemed as if she might survive. Her armor deflected several hits. Her crew kept fighting with mechanical precision. But American pilots had studied her design. They knew her weaknesses, the gaps in her torpedo protection system, the exposed joints of her armor belt. They aimed for the same side again and again, forcing the ship to list further. By 11:00 a.m., Yamato was bleeding steel and fire. Her port side was submerged to the waterline. Smoke poured from her funnels, yet the attacks did not stop. A third wave arrived this time from the east, hammering the already burning decks. Bombs ripped through the anti-aircraft platforms, silencing the guns one by one. Torpedoes struck near the boiler rooms, extinguishing power to the pumps. Without them, the flooding accelerated uncontrollably. Below deck, chaos turned to horror. Men waded through knee-deep seawater mixed with oil. Electric lights flickered, casting shadows on faces streaked with soot. Medics moved through the darkness, wrapping bandages on wounds that would never heal. One sailor, barely 19, shouted into the noise, "Is this how the sea sounds when it dies?" On the surface, the ship's giant 18.1-inch guns still fired twice each blast, sending shockwaves across the ocean. But there were no targets. The sky was filled only with moving shadows and flame. The gunners fired at ghosts until their ammunition ran out. At 11:30, the final wave arrived, and 2 torpedoes struck almost simultaneously on the port side near midship. The hull groaned under the strain, bending as if alive. Compartments flooded instantly, drowning hundreds trapped inside. The list increased to 20 degrees. Yamato's engines faltered. The ship began to slow. Captain Aruga, drenched in smoke and oil, shouted through the chaos, "Prepare to abandon ship." But Admiral Ito shook his head. "We will not abandon Yamato," he said. "This is where she was meant to die." At 12:00 noon, the ship was on her side, engulfed in fire. Her remaining gunners fired upward until the barrels glowed red. Bombs continued to fall, each one hammering the sea like the fists of gods. One American pilot circling above described the scene in disbelief. It looked like the ocean itself was exploding. The ship wasn't sinking, it was dissolving. The attack had lasted barely 90 minutes, yet it unleashed more destructive force than the entire Battle of Tsushima 40 years earlier. In that hour and a half, the age of battleships ended forever. If you believe that no amount of courage can survive against overwhelming firepower, type 4 in the comments. If you still believe Yamato could have changed history under different skies, press like. Because what comes next is not battle, it's extinction. By 12:15 p.m., the East China Sea had become a graveyard of smoke and flame. Yamato, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, now drifted helplessly, her mighty guns silent, her decks torn open and burning. The air reeked of oil fire and metal. Black columns of smoke spiraled thousands of feet into the sky, marking her position like a funeral pyre visible from miles away. Inside the ship, chaos no longer had direction. Entire compartments were gone, replaced by fire and flooding. The engine rooms were underwater. The boiler rooms had become tombs. Survivors stumbled through smoke-filled corridors, clutching burned hands, gasping for air. The heat was so intense that brass fittings melted fusing hatches shut. Many men died trying to open doors that no longer existed. In the forward battery, gunner Seiji Nakamura and his crew tried to aim the secondary guns, but the controls had failed. It was like steering a dead body, he recalled. Ammunition cooked off around them, the deck plates warping under their feet. Then came a sound deeper than thunder, a hollow roar rising from below decks, followed by a sudden stillness. Everyone froze, Nakamura said later. It was the sound of something alive breathing its last breath. Above the ship's once proud superstructure was unrecognizable. Fires raged unchecked across the bridge. The paint blistered and peeled, turning the steel beneath into molten rivers. Captain Kosaku Aruga, his uniform blackened, refused to leave his post. He ordered the remaining gunners to keep firing, but there was no target left, only the endless storm of American planes retreating northward. The battle was already over. Only the dying remained to witness it. At 12:23, torpedoes struck Yamato's port side almost simultaneously. The massive hull shuddered, groaning like a wounded animal. Metal screamed as entire bulkheads collapsed. In the lower decks, hundreds of men were instantly drowned or crushed as seawater surged through ruptured compartments. The ship listed violently to port, then steadied, defying gravity for a brief, impossible moment. On the bridge, Admiral Ito stood motionless. His cap was gone, his face streaked with soot. An aide shouted, "Admiral, we must abandon ship." Ito shook his head. "A flagship does not run from death," he said quietly. He turned to his communications officer and gave his final order. "Transmit to Tokyo. The fleet has fought to the end." Those were the last words ever sent from Yamato. By 12:30, the list reached 30 degrees. Men began throwing themselves into the sea, their bodies lit by the reflection of fire on the waves. Those who jumped were either pulled under by suction or burned by oil floating on the surface. The water itself had turned to flame. A survivor later said the sea was on fire. You could not tell where the ship ended and the ocean began. At 12:45, disaster reached its final crescendo. A torpedo struck near the aft magazines. Deep below deck, 7,000 tons of ammunition and fuel ignited in a single, unimaginable blast. Witnesses on nearby ships saw Yamato vanish in an instant. The explosion tore through the sea, splitting the battleship in half. A mushroom cloud of smoke and debris rose 6 kilometers into the air, so vast that American pilots reported seeing it from 120 miles away. For a moment, day turned to night. The blast wave flattened the nearby destroyer Yahagi and hurled men into the sky like leaves. Then came the rain fragments of steel burning oil and the bodies of sailors falling back into the ocean. The explosion had released energy equivalent to 3,000 tons of TNT, almost one-fifth the power of the atomic bomb, dropped on Hiroshima just 4 months later. When the fireball faded, only wreckage remained. The largest warship ever built, 72,000 tons of armor, 18-inch guns, and engineering genius, was gone. In her place was an expanding circle of oil flame and silence. Out of 3,056 men aboard, only 269 survived. Most of them were picked up by destroyers hours later, shivering, burned half-blind from the blast. Some refused rescue, insisting they would rather die with their ship. "She was our mother," one sailor whispered as he slipped beneath the waves. "We could not leave her alone." Far above, American pilots circled the scene, stunned by what they had witnessed. Lieutenant Roy Corbin, who had flown one of the first attack runs, later wrote, "We watched the largest ship in the world disappear under a single cloud. I didn't cheer. None of us did. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like we had erased something ancient." The sea gradually calmed, as if exhausted by what it had seen. The smoke drifted away on the wind, leaving only floating debris helmets, life rings, fragments of wood. The once mighty Yamato symbol of Japan's pride and industrial ambition had been reduced to ash and memory in less than 2 hours. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy would suppress news of her loss. No official announcement was made. For a time, even families of the crew were told that the ship was still on duty, but those who lived near the coast could see the truth for themselves. The western horizon glowed red that night, as if the sunset had lasted too long. They understood what it meant. Yamato had died as she was born, in fire and silence. The pride of an empire had met the precision of industrial warfare, and the result was not battle, but obliteration. If you believe that firepower without restraint is more terrifying than any weapon Type 5 in the comments. If you believe Yamato's death was not destruction, but transformation, a warning carved into history, press-like. Because what comes next is not noise or glory, it's silence, the sound of an empire ending. News of Yamato's disappearance reached Tokyo not through official channels, but through fragments of intercepted radio messages and the whispers of officers returning from the Southern Front. The first reports were confused phrases like heavy damage communication lost ship, not responding. In the Imperial Navy's headquarters at the Ministry of the Navy, men stood in silence around a single radio set, listening to static. Then came the final signal transmitted moments before the ship exploded. The fleet has fought to the end. Nothing followed. The line went dead. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Admiral Suemu Toyota, chief of the combined fleet, removed his glasses and stared at the floor. Around him, aides waited for orders that would never come. The room felt hollow, the air heavy with something larger than defeat. Toyota finally spoke, his voice calm but distant. "Do not release this information," he said. "There will be no announcement until further notice." The order was obeyed immediately. The loss of Yamato was classified as military confidential. Even within the Navy, few were told the truth. To admit that Japan's greatest ship, the symbol of the nation's invincibility, had been sunk in less than 2 hours by aircraft alone would have destroyed what little morale remained. The Imperial Navy's reputation had been built on the myth of unshakable steel and divine courage. The reality was far crueler, Modern warfare had rendered both meaningless. That evening, in a dimly lit office overlooking the Imperial Palace, Toyota met with senior staff. "Gentlemen," he said, "if Yamato cannot survive, nothing can." No one answered. An officer poured him tea with trembling hands. The sound of the porcelain cup striking the saucer echoed through the room. Outside, the city was silent except for the distant wail of air raid sirens. Tokyo was burning again that night under another American bombing run. For the men of the Navy, the loss of Yamato was more than a tactical failure. It was a spiritual collapse. The ship had represented everything the Japanese Empire believed about itself: precision, strength, endurance. Now all of that lay beneath the sea, reduced to ash and oil. Even the survivors who were rescued by destroyers were ordered to silence. They were isolated in medical wards, forbidden to write letters or speak of what they had seen. One sailor later recalled, "They told us Yamato still lives, but we knew we had seen her die." Inside the imperial household, the news was softened before reaching Emperor Hirohito. Advisors described the event as a heavy loss during combat. The full truth was hidden as if secrecy could delay reality. But even the emperor, who had studied naval engineering, understood the implication. He turned to one of his aides and said quietly, "If Yamato has fallen, the sea no longer protects us." It was a rare moment of clarity from a man who ruled through distance and ritual. In the following days, the Ministry of Information issued statements describing Japan's heroic resistance off Okinawa. Radio broadcasts spoke of a great naval engagement and the destruction of many enemy aircraft. The word Yamato was never mentioned. To the public, she simply vanished. Only after the war did civilians learn that the ship had existed at all. Meanwhile, American intelligence confirmed her sinking within hours. Aerial reconnaissance photographs taken from B-29S showed a massive oil slick spreading across the sea 5 miles wide, iridescent under the sunlight. Analysts at Pearl Harbor and Washington studied the images in stunned silence. The largest battleship ever built had been erased from the ocean by the very weapon she was designed to resist. It was not just victory, it was vindication. In Tokyo, however, there was no celebration, no ceremony, no eulogy. The men who had built Yamato walked through the shipyards of Kure in disbelief. The dry docks stood empty, the cranes rusting the workshops silent. One engineer wrote in his diary, "We built her to be immortal." But even steel has a soul, and hers is gone. The loss of Yamato forced the Navy to confront an unbearable truth: the age of battleships had ended. Japan's entire naval doctrine, based on decisive surface engagements, was obsolete. The Americans had not just defeated Japan's fleet, they had rewritten the meaning of naval warfare. Planes, not guns, now ruled the seas. Yet for all its military consequences, the emotional impact was deeper. Yamato had been the embodiment of a national myth that through sacrifice and precision, Japan could overcome any enemy. Her death shattered that illusion. Officers who once preached loyalty now spoke of futility. Cadets at the Naval Academy in Etajima wept openly when the news was confirmed. "It was as if our hearts stopped beating," one of them later said. In the weeks that followed, the Navy ceased to exist as an effective force. The remaining ships were trapped in port out of fuel and surrounded by ruin. By June, American carrier strikes destroyed what little remained of Japan's surface fleet. When the atomic bombs fell in August, there were no admirals left to give orders. The empire that had believed itself unsinkable followed its flagship into the deep. History would later remember Yamato as more than a ship. She was the last echo of an age that believed courage could defy technology, that willpower could outlast science. Her destruction was not just the end of a vessel, but the end of a world view. In Tokyo, that silence, the silence of the unspoken of pride collapsing inward, was louder than any explosion. If you believe that pride is the most fragile armor in war, type 6 in the comments. If you believe Yamato's death was not defeat but awakening, a moment when even empires learned humility, press like. Because what remains after pride and steel are gone is not power, but reflection. And that reflection still lingers on the quiet waters of Kure, where the sea remembers everything. When the fire over the East China Sea finally died, something larger than a battleship sank with Yamato. What went down with her was the idea that steel alone could rule the oceans. The explosion that tore her in half marked not just the end of Japan's mightiest warship, but the death of an entire era. In the days that followed, the wreckage drifted quietly across the waves. Oil slicks shimmered like black mirrors under the spring sun. Pilots flying reconnaissance over the area described the sight as haunting, a faint circle of flame still flickering on the surface, surrounded by endless calm. The ocean had swallowed a mountain of steel and left almost no trace. From that moment, every admiral in the world understood the sea was no longer governed by ships but by the sky above them. The age of the battleship, of armor mass and brute force, had ended in 90 minutes. The new masters of the sea had wings, not hulls. In Washington, analysts studied the battle reports with fascination. 11 carriers, 386 aircraft, and a coordination so precise that no attack wave overlapped another. It was firepower transformed into an equation. The Yamato's destruction proved that industrial science could achieve what courage and craftsmanship could not: absolute control over the battlefield. Machines, guided by mathematics, had defeated human pride. For the United States, it was vindication of a vision first tested at Midway and refined over 3 relentless years of war. Air power had rendered the ocean transparent. A battleship could no longer hide. Radar would find it, sonar would track it, and precision bombing would destroy it from 100 miles away. Yamato was not merely sunk. She was dissected, analyzed, and erased by a system designed for efficiency, not emotion. In Japan, the silence that followed was unbearable. The Imperial Navy, stripped of its fleets and its purpose, ceased to exist as a fighting force. Shipyards that had once thundered with the sound of hammer and steel now echoed with emptiness. The engineers who had built Yamato spent the final months of the war dismantling smaller ships for scrap metal. One of them, in a post-war interview, said quietly, "We built her to change the world, but she was already a ghost when she sailed." When the war ended in August and Japan signed its surrender aboard the USS Missouri, the symbolism was cruelly poetic. The ceremony took place on the deck of another American battleship, one that owed its existence to the very philosophy Yamato had embodied, yet survived because it had been protected by aircraft carriers. The contrast was complete. The American Navy stood beneath a sky filled with planes, while Japan's greatest ship lay in pieces beneath the sea. After 1945, the world no longer built giants like Yamato or Musashi. The new age belonged to aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, and guided missiles, machines of speed and precision, not weight and armor. Every navy studied the sinking of Yamato as a lesson written in steel and flame. No fortress is invincible, no armor thick enough to resist the sky. But beyond strategy, the story of Yamato carried something human. Her death was the moment when modern war revealed its true face, not glory, but calculation, not heroism, but numbers. She was the perfect machine for the wrong century, a monument to a belief that had already expired. In her final hours, she had shown the world what happens when pride and progress collide. Today, divers who visit her resting place describe a silence that feels alive. The hull lies upside down, half buried in silt, her massive gun still pointing uselessly into the dark. No inscription marks her grave, no flag waves above her. Only the cold, slow heartbeat of the ocean remains. Fish swim through her corridors, and in the stillness the echoes of her engines seem to hum again for a moment before fading into nothing. For Japan, the name Yamato would never lose its power. It became a symbol of sacrifice and endurance of beauty, destroyed by inevitability. In post-war years, poets wrote of her as if she were a fallen samurai, the last warrior of an age that refused to die quietly. To many she represented not defeat, but awakening. The realization that honor without understanding leads only to ruin. When historians speak of the end of the battleship era, they rarely mention the faces of the men who went down with her, the 3,000 young sailors whose lives became part of that transformation. But in a way they were witnesses to the moment the world turned from steel to sky. Their deaths marked the beginning of a new order, one that would define the next 100 years of warfare. From above it might have looked simple, a black shape vanishing beneath white foam. But to those who built her, who manned her, and who watched her die, Yamato's final plunge was not just the sinking of a ship, it was the sound of the 20th century being rewritten. When the sky fell on the sea, the ocean changed forever. If you believe that progress always demands a sacrifice, type 7 in the comments. If you believe Yamato's story is not about war, but about humanity, learning its limits, press like. And don't forget to subscribe, because next time we'll tell the story of another impossible weapon and how American destroyers turned mathematics into death destroyers hunted like wolves.